Do you have a secret that if even one person were to learn it, your life would turn in a completely different direction? It sounds frightening, but there are people who have had to carry secrets that could never be allowed to surface because a single misstep could cause everything they spent a lifetime building to vanish in an instant. And Hollywood once forced many sitcom actors to live exactly that way. Some had to invent stories about having wives and children recounting family tragedies that never existed, all to conceal the same gender partner they were actually living with. Some were pressured by their own management companies into staged marriages simply to silence the rumors spreading behind the scenes. And others remained silent for their entire lives, only daring to speak the truth when they were nearing the end. This is the story of 15 sitcom actors who tried to conceal their same-gender relationships and the price they paid for that silence. 1. Dick Sargent, a man who only spoke his truth when his life was nearly over. Few people realize that when Dick Sargent was chosen to replace Dick York on Bewitched in 1969, the challenge was not only whether audiences would accept a new Darren Stevens, it was also about ensuring that his personal life never became public. At the time Bewitched aired on ABC during prime time, closely tied to the image of the ideal middle-class American family. Any perceived moral risk could have caused sponsors to withdraw immediately. According to behind-the-scenes accounts documented by journalist Bose Hadley in his research on classic Hollywood, Dick Sargent was required to agree to unwritten arrangements with his agent and the network's publicity department. He was advised to avoid gathering places commonly frequented by non-conforming artists in Los Angeles, not to be seen regularly in West Hollywood, and under no circumstances to be photographed with another man in a way that could invite speculation. Even short vacations were carefully planned so that he appeared in the company of larger groups, minimizing attention. Throughout the 1970s, rumors began circulating in the form of vague, indirect mentions in entertainment magazines. Confidential once published a piece hinting at a family television star who frequently dines privately with a male companion at a restaurant in Santa Monica. No names were mentioned, no photos were printed. But within the industry, Dick Sargent's name surfaced most often. As a result, for several months afterward, he nearly stopped attending social events or public gatherings beyond those strictly required by contract. More notably, a former ABC public relations employee later revealed that at least once in late 1972, the network directly intervened to prevent a tabloid reporter from approaching Sargent's long-term partner in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Los Angeles. The incident never reached the press, but from that point on, security and caution around Dick Sargent increased noticeably. He was advised to change daily routines, limit visitors to his home, and ensure that all private meetings were conducted with extreme discretion. Living under this prolonged state of vigilance, Sargent once confided to friends that he felt as though he was playing two roles at once, and the role in real life was more exhausting than the one on screen. Still, he remained silent, because the consequences of speaking openly at that time were painfully clear. It was not until 1991, after stepping away from the spotlight and no longer bound by television contracts, that Dick Sargent chose to publicly acknowledge himself at a small event marking National Coming Out Day. It was the first time he openly recognized the same gender relationship he had concealed for decades. That delay was not due to a lack of courage, but because for most of his life, Dick Sargent understood that speaking too early would have cost him everything. And his story was not unique. There were others who were forced to conceal themselves in even more complex and damaging ways. 2. Paul Lynde, making audiences laugh for a lifetime but never daring to live honestly. If Dick Sargent concealed himself through withdrawal and silence, Paul Lynde employed a far more intricate strategy. He turned himself into such an exaggerated comedic figure that no one dared to ask deeper questions. During the peak years of Hollywood Squares, Lynde appeared almost weekly on NBC, becoming a safe comedic presence for family audiences. Behind the scenes, however, his personal life was shaped by constant compromise. According to research compiled by journalists Steve Susoy and Bose Hadley, Paul Lynde lived for many years with a long-term partner in Los Angeles. This relationship was widely known within theater and television circles, but carefully shielded from the public. Lynde rarely appeared with his partner in public, and when he did, it was always within larger groups to avoid drawing attention. Trips to Palm Springs, a popular retreat for entertainers, were deliberately scheduled during off-seasons, avoiding periods of heavy media activity. This careful concealment nearly collapsed in 1976 when Paul Lynde became involved in a controversial incident in Beverly Hills while intoxicated. While mainstream outlets reported the event briefly and without detail, tabloid journalists immediately began probing his private life. Some reporters even attempted to contact neighbors near Lynde's home to gather background information. NBC was reportedly forced to intervene, requesting limited coverage and temporarily reducing Lynde's on-air appearances. After this incident, Lynde became even more guarded. He largely stopped answering questions about his personal life, redirecting interviews toward his work, or deflecting inquiries with humor that was deliberately ambiguous. A longtime editor at TV Guide once remarked that Lynde understood the rules very well. He was allowed to be different as long as no one had to name that difference. The cost of concealing a same-gender relationship for so many years was not limited to emotional strain. It also led to increasing isolation. Friends later recalled that Lynde became more withdrawn, increasingly dependent on alcohol, and gradually lost meaningful connections outside of work. When Paul Lynde died suddenly in 1982 in Los Angeles, television tributes focused solely on his comedic talent and successful career, while the restrained and hidden part of his life was almost entirely absent from the official narrative. Paul Lynde's story shows that concealment does not always take the form of silence. Some choose to speak constantly, laugh loudly, and become such a defined persona that no one dares to ask who the real person behind it might be. And it is often this kind of concealment that allows the tragedy to persist far longer than audiences ever imagined. 3. Charles Nelson. Reilly, allowed to be flamboyant on stage but not allowed to love in real life. For Charles Nelson, Reilly concealment did not come through total silence, but through a far more calculated approach, allowing audiences to see everything except the truth. Throughout the 1970s, Reilly became an indispensable presence on game shows such as Match Game, known for his theatrical mannerisms, dramatic voice, and lightning-fast humor. Audiences laughed at his eccentricity, but that very eccentricity was the safe space television permitted. According to colleagues who worked with Reilly at CBS and NBC, there existed an unwritten rule specifically for him. He could be unconventional, exaggerated, and entertainingly different as long as he never explicitly identified who he was. Once the camera stopped rolling, Reilly understood this boundary perfectly. He never publicly acknowledged a romantic partner, never brought anyone to industry events, and never allowed the press access to his private life. Privately, Charles Nelson Reilly maintained a decades-long relationship with Broadway theater director Patrick Hughes. They lived together and shared daily life, but everything was kept strictly private. After tapings, Reilly often left the studio, quickly avoiding backstage gatherings where rumors could easily arise. A former Match Game production assistant once recalled that Reilly was always among the last to arrive and the first to leave, as if he refused to let anyone glimpse the life beyond the character. What is striking is that within the industry, nearly everyone knew. Writers, host, and even production staff were aware of Reilly's relationship, but this shared understanding existed in silence. No one wrote about it. No one spoke openly because he remained a safe figure as long as the situation was left unnamed. Acknowledging the truth would have transformed that safety into unnecessary risk. For many years, Reilly maintained this fragile balance until television itself began to change in the late 1980s. As he gradually withdrew from game shows and returned to the theater, he began speaking more openly about himself in spaces no longer governed by the strict oversight of mainstream television. Even so, most of his career had already passed with him, existing primarily as a character rather than as a fully lived individual. Charles Nelson Reilly's story shows that some people do not conceal themselves by disappearing, but by appearing too often until audiences see only a carefully constructed image. And in some cases, concealment extends beyond image alone, becoming an entire alternate life built for survival. 4. Raymond Burr, a man who invented a wife and children to conceal the person he lived with for over 30 years. Raymond Burr chose an even more extreme path. He constructed an entirely different life for the world to believe. During his years portraying Perry Mason, Burr was not only a highly successful television actor, but also a symbol of the mature, steady, and trustworthy man. That image was reinforced by personal stories he himself shared. Beginning in the late 1950s, Burr told the press about wives he had lost and children who had tragically died in supposed family misfortunes. These stories appeared repeatedly in interviews published by TV Guide Photoplay and several major entertainment magazines. No one verified them because no one imagined that a leading television star would fabricate such losses. The seriousness and consistency with which Burr told these stories made them believable. Meanwhile, in his private life, Raymond Burr lived with actor and producer Robert Benavides. The two met in the 1950s and remained together for more than 3 decades. In public, however, Benavides was introduced only as a business partner or a longtime friend. They jointly developed an orchid farm in California, traveled abroad together, and managed investment projects side by side, yet never revealed any indication of a personal relationship. According to later investigative journalism, there were at least 2 occasions in the 1960s when tabloid reporters attempted to verify the family history Burr had described. Each time, his representatives intervened quickly, supplying alternative information or redirecting attention toward his charitable work and social activities. The narrative of a widowed man grieving the loss of his children became a perfect shield, making further curiosity appear insensitive. Only after Raymond Burr's death in 1993 did biographers begin to piece together the inconsistencies. There were no marriage records, no birth certificates for the children he had mentioned, and the family stories were gradually confirmed to be fictional. It was only then that the more than 30-year relationship between Burr and Benavides could be discussed openly without evasion or euphemism. What shocked people was not the existence of the relationship itself, but how far Burr had gone to conceal it. He did not merely protect his career, he constructed an entirely separate identity to survive in Hollywood. It was then that many realized that for some stars, concealment was not simply silence, but the creation of a fully imagined alternative life. After Raymond Burr, Hollywood continued to produce similar stories where the truth was buried not out of shame but out of fear of losing everything. And some chose yet another path, constructing marriages, public images, and relationships to protect their secrets. 5. Rock Hudson, a staged marriage built to save a career. For Rock Hudson, concealment was neither silence nor avoidance, but a carefully orchestrated plan. From the late 1940s, when Universal Pictures elevated Hudson to the status of a leading man, the studio quickly recognized that his image had to align perfectly with the post-war American ideal of masculinity. Tall, handsome, and possessing a deep, reassuring voice, Hudson was crafted as the man every woman was meant to admire. However, within Hollywood circles, rumors about Hudson's private life began circulating as early as the early 1950s. Tabloid reporters closely followed his personal associations, particularly discreet trips to Palm Springs and private gatherings among close acquaintances. To counter this, his agent Henry Wilson chose a familiar yet highly effective solution of the era, a marriage designed for public appearance. In 1955, Rock Hudson married Phyllis Gates, his agent's secretary. The wedding was arranged quickly, widely publicized, and accompanied by articles praising the movie star who had settled into married life. During their nearly 3-year marriage, Hudson and Gates appeared together at major events but showed few signs of a genuine domestic relationship. Those close to them later revealed that the marriage primarily served to silence growing rumors in the press. After the divorce in 1958, Hudson returned to single life, but by then his image had been stabilized. Studios continued arranging public appearances with well-known actresses, and carefully documented dates were used to reinforce a conventional public narrative. When he transitioned to television in the early 1970s with Macmillan and wife Hudson, was once again cast as a composed husband, further convincing audiences that earlier rumors had been unfounded. This concealment lasted until 1985, when Rock Hudson was hospitalized in Paris, and information about his health could no longer be controlled. Within weeks, the protective structure built over more than 3 decades collapsed. What stunned the public was not only the truth itself, but the extent to which an entire system had functioned to keep it hidden. And while Hudson became the center of a broader public conversation, many others chose to continue their silence through less visible strategies. 6. Cesar Romero, maintaining the image of the charming bachelor to avoid acknowledgement. Unlike Rock Hudson, who relied on marriage as a shield, Cesar Romero chose a quieter but equally enduring strategy, remaining unmarried. From the 1930s through the 1980s, Romero presented himself to the public as the ideal Latin gentleman, elegant, courteous, always smiling, and always single. At film premieres, Romero often appeared alongside famous actresses, providing the press with photographs and stories, but never allowing any relationship to be labeled serious. When asked about his romantic life, he skillfully redirected conversations toward work travel, or simply stated that he valued freedom too much for long-term commitments. These responses were repeated so consistently that they became part of his personal brand. Within the industry, Romero's approach was well understood. He avoided environments prone to scrutiny, rarely allowed outsiders into his private life, and maintained an exceptionally tight circle of friends. When he joined the Batman series in the 1960s as the Joker, his image was further reinforced as that of a distinctive performer, where eccentricity was viewed as part of his craft rather than a reflection of his personal life. For decades, rumors persisted, but never crossed the threshold of speculation. There were no investigations, no major exposés, because Romero left no clear fragments to assemble. When he died in 1994, tributes celebrated a career spanning more than half a century, while questions about his personal life remained unresolved. His silence was not a sign of weakness, but a calculated choice that allowed him to navigate Hollywood's shifting landscape without being pushed aside. But not everyone could choose the path of the safe bachelor as Romero did, especially those tied to rigid masculine ideals where even the smallest crack could cause everything to collapse. 7. Rory Calhoun, upholding a rugged cowboy image to conceal personal life. For Rory Calhoun, the pressure did not come only from Hollywood itself, but from the genre that defined his career. Television westerns like The Texan were not merely entertainment. They embodied the idealized American man, strong, direct, and leaving no room for ambiguity. In that world, even a hint of doubt about personal life could alienate audiences. As his career rose in the 1950s, studios required Calhoun to maintain an exceptionally strict image. He rarely spoke about his private life, never revealed relationships to the press, and consistently appeared with a reserved demeanor, befitting the cowboy who offers no explanations. His personal travel was kept discreet, schedules tightly controlled, and private meetings almost never occurred in public spaces. Tabloids repeatedly attempted to investigate Calhoun's private life, particularly during a period when magazines like Confidential profited from challenging traditional, masculine icons. Although no direct exposé emerged, the constant scrutiny forced Calhoun into a state of heightened vigilance. Close friends later recalled that he was always aware that a single mistake could undo everything he had built. Calhoun's career spanned decades, but the cost was a severely constrained personal life. When he died in 1999, information about his private world began to surface cautiously, revealing that behind the rugged cowboy image was a man who had suppressed much of himself to remain standing on screen. Looking back, it becomes clear that concealment takes many forms. Some construct marriages, some choose lifelong bachelorhood. Others brace themselves within rigid ideals of masculinity. Yet behind it all, Hollywood continued to generate stories in which people were forced to erase parts of themselves in order to survive. 8. Will Geer, concealing personal life while caught between political repression and Hollywood morality. Long before becoming the gentle grandfather on the Waltons' will, Geer understood that certain truths in Hollywood were not only dangerous to a career, but potentially to one's entire life. As early as the 1930s, during his active years in New York and Los Angeles theater circles, Geer maintained close relationships with early advocates for same-gender rights. Among them was Harry Hay, who later founded the Mattachine Society, an organization closely monitored by authorities for years. Geer's challenge was not limited to one perceived liability. Under Hollywood's moral standards, he carried another burden as well: left-wing political beliefs. When the McCarthy era swept through Hollywood in the early 1950s, Geer was quickly blacklisted for his political activism and views. From that point forward, nearly all opportunities in film and television were shut off. Under these circumstances, openly acknowledging any personal relationship would not only have ended his employment prospects, but could have permanently removed him from the industry. Geer was forced to retreat to theater, founding an outdoor performance venue in California to sustain his work while maintaining absolute discretion about his private life. Those who knew him at the time recalled that he rarely spoke about relationships, and when questioned, he redirected conversations toward politics or art. It was not until the late 1960s, as social attitudes began to shift and the Waltons brought him back to television, that Will Geer could appear publicly in a safe, uncontroversial role. Even then, silence regarding his personal life remained a requirement. He survived 2 parallel witch hunts, one political, one moral, by ensuring that no part of himself crossed beyond the boundaries deemed acceptable. Will Geer's story illustrates that some people concealed themselves not only because of Hollywood, but because of a much larger system of power poised to erase them. And while Geer sacrificed personal life in exchange for a return to public view, others chose even quieter paths, enduring decades of silence without ever speaking openly at all. 9. Jim Nabors, only able to publicly acknowledge his long-term partner after turning 80. When Gomer Pyle USMC premiered in 1964, Jim Nabors quickly became a familiar image of innocence and kindness on American television. The character Gomer, known for his distinctive voice and gentle personality, was widely regarded as completely safe, especially at a time when the United States was tense from war and social division. But that very image became a lock that tightly sealed Nabors' private life. For decades, Jim Nabors revealed almost nothing about his romantic life. He did not marry, did not publicly date, and consistently kept a distance from the press whenever conversations drifted toward personal matters. Within the entertainment world, the close relationship between Nabors and Rock Hudson was often the subject of quiet talk, but it never moved beyond whispers. Any confirmation at the time could have shattered the carefully maintained image associated with Gomer Pyle. In the early 1970s, Nabors left Hollywood and moved to Hawaii. The decision was explained as a search for peace and quiet, but those close to him understood it was also a way to escape constant media scrutiny. There, Nabors built a stable, private life with a partner, yet kept it entirely out of public view. Even as his television career gradually came to an end, that habit of silence did not change. It was not until 2013, after U.S. law recognized same-gender marriage, and Jim Nabors was 82, that he officially married Stan Cadwallader, the companion who had been by his side for nearly 4 decades. The news surprised many viewers, but within the industry, it was simply a truth spoken far too late. Nabors spent most of his life protecting the image television demanded, and only when the risks no longer felt real did he allow himself to live openly. That delay raises a painful question. Without changes in law and social attitudes, would Jim Nabors ever have been able to speak his truth at all? And while Nabors chose decades of silence, others built entire careers on refusing to answer any question connected to private life. 10. Tony Randall, a man who never answered a single question about his private life throughout his career. Unlike many of his peers, Tony Randall did not conceal himself by constructing an early public marriage narrative or retreating from the spotlight. He chose another path, more persistent and more emotionally detached. He said nothing at all. Since rising to fame as Felix Unger in The Odd Couple, Randall was associated with the image of an intellectual, meticulous man, someone who seemed slightly outside traditional expectations of masculinity. That difference fueled rumors for years. The press and audiences repeatedly speculated about Randall's personal life, especially because he almost never shared anything beyond his work. In interviews, any question about romance was skillfully avoided and redirected toward theater opera or acting technique. This strategy helped Tony Randall maintain a stable career for decades. He married Florence Gibbs and maintained that marriage for 50 years, a detail often cited as evidence of a steady private life. However, after she died, Randall's unexpected second marriage late in life to a woman much younger than he was sparked a new wave of speculation showing that public curiosity never truly disappeared. Notably, even while pursued by rumor throughout his career, Tony Randall never allowed it to overshadow his work. He maintained a clear, almost rigid boundary between the person on stage and the person off it. When he died in 2004, even obituaries and tributes could not agree on how to frame his private life, evidence that the silence Randall maintained endured to the very end. Tony Randall's story shows that concealment is not always about inventing another narrative. Sometimes it is simply refusing to tell any narrative at all. And in this list, there are still people who went even further to protect their secrets through choices that force the public to reconsider how Hollywood once operated. 11. Clifton Webb, living as the model bachelor to conceal a private life. In Hollywood's first half of the 20th century, being single was not always viewed as dangerous. If presented correctly, it could even become a perfect form of cover. Clifton Webb understood this early, from the 1940s onward, as he rose to prominence with an on-screen image of refinement, intelligence, and sharp wit. Webb was positioned as the kind of gentleman who did not need a family to prove his worth. Webb never married, and he was never publicly linked to a visible romantic relationship. Yet rather than raising suspicion, the press of the era framed it positively. Articles in Photoplay and Life often portrayed him as a man who lived only for art, devoted to disciplined classical music and intellectual pleasures. That sophistication gave his privacy an aura of dignity rather than inviting scrutiny. One detail frequently mentioned was that Clifton Webb lived with his mother for many years. In that era of Hollywood, the image of a devoted son was not only harmless, but admirable. This unintentionally created a near-perfect safe zone where curiosity about his personal life could be neutralized by appeals to family values. Those in the industry who understood more chose to remain quiet as well. Webb caused no scandal and maintained a spotless public image. Clifton Webb's strategy was to leave no piece of evidence clear enough to assemble into a complete story. Everything remained just ambiguous enough that no one could publish a definitive narrative. As a result, Webb sustained a stable career for decades, passing through Hollywood's most restrictive period without becoming entangled in scandal. When he died in 1966, tributes maintained the same tone, praising his talent, noting his elegance, and avoiding any mention of private life. The ambiguity Clifton Webb built stayed with him to the end, showing that sometimes the most effective concealment is not to fabricate another story, but to become someone who is never expected to have that story in the first place. But not everyone could hide behind refinement and social privilege. For women in classic Hollywood, the pressure took a different shape, where fitting a proper image became a condition for survival. 12. Marjorie Main, relying on a traditional mother image to conceal a long-term relationship. American audiences remember Marjorie Main as the loud but warm-hearted rural mother or grandmother figure, appearing in many MGM family films from the 1940s onward. That image became so deeply rooted that the public rarely questioned her private life, and that became her strongest protection. After a short marriage that ended early in her career, Marjorie Main did not remarry. Instead, she lived for many years with actress Spring Byington, who was often seen alongside Main both professionally and in daily life. They shared a home, attended events together, and appeared side by side at gatherings with friends. Yet everything was always described using a safe label, close friends. Within film circles, the special closeness between Main and Byington was not unfamiliar. However, given the national mother image Main represented for studios and ticket sales, no studio wanted that closeness to become a point of controversy. Entertainment press coverage often emphasized Main's simplicity, private lifestyle, and family-oriented personality, steering away from any speculation that might damage the traditional feminine image audiences valued. Marjorie Main also never tried to explain or deny anything. She maintained a firm boundary between work and personal life, not allowing the press to cross it. In a period when independent women already made society uneasy, maintaining the image of a kind mother, non-threatening to the family order, was the safest way to endure. When Marjorie Main died in 1975, her long relationship with Spring Byington was still described in vague terms such as a close companion. No truth was confirmed and no direct questions were asked. And that silence suggests that for many actresses, concealment was not about lying, but about allowing society to see only what it wanted to see. However, not everyone was protected by such a positive public image. Some people, even without publicly confirming anything, still became targets of endless labeling and rumor. 13. Agnes Moorehead, becoming the target of speculation despite never publicly acknowledging any relationship. Agnes Moorehead represents one of the most painful cases of classic Hollywood because she was not concealing a specific relationship, but instead spent her entire life resisting labels imposed by others. Best known for her role as Endora in Bewitched, Moorehead possessed a strong presence, sharp intelligence, and a demeanor that differed greatly from the soft, traditionally feminine image favored by television at the time. That difference made her a persistent target of speculation. Despite having been married and divorced, and despite maintaining a private and restrained personal life, Moorehead was repeatedly questioned by both the press and the public about her romantic life. Whenever she appeared alongside a close female friend, rumors resurfaced despite the absence of evidence or confirmation. What made the situation more distressing was that Agnes Moorehead publicly denied these assumptions on multiple occasions, describing them as deeply offensive to her character and personal beliefs. In interviews throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, she expressed exhaustion at having to repeatedly explain a private life she believed did not belong to the public. The harm did not come from exposure, but from attribution. Moorehead lived in a constant state of defense, not to hide a relationship, but to protect her right to define herself. When she died in 1974, some obituaries still reference the long-standing rumors illustrating how public speculation can persist even after the subject is no longer alive. Agnes Moorehead's case reveals another dark side of Hollywood. Not only those who concealed something were harmed, but even those who said nothing and did nothing could become victims of collective curiosity. And within this list, there are still figures for whom denial and concealment were taken to even more extreme levels through direct confrontation with the press and the public. 14. Liberace, performing an openly suggestive stage persona while firmly denying it in private life. No one on this list embodied a greater contradiction than Liberace. On stage and television from the 1950s onward, he appeared in sparkling capes, played the piano, surrounded by candlelight, and adopted a theatrical style that openly challenged traditional ideas of masculinity. At the same time, Liberace was among the most forceful in denying any questions about his private life. From the beginning of his television career, Liberace understood one crucial distinction audiences could accept: exaggerated flamboyance as entertainment, but would withdraw support if it were identified as personal reality. As a result, he deliberately constructed a parallel narrative alongside his stage persona. In interviews with TV Guide people and on major talk shows, Liberace frequently spoke about women, discussed the possibility of future marriage, and referenced romantic relationships he was considering even while living with male partners during different periods of his life. This contradiction erupted into a major public controversy in 1956, when a British newspaper suggested that Liberace's private life did not align with his public image. Rather than remaining silent, Liberace confronted the issue directly. He sued the publication for defamation, asserted that his reputation had been damaged, and won the case, receiving substantial compensation. The lawsuit not only silenced rumors at the time, but also sent a clear message to the press: this boundary was not to be crossed. After the lawsuit, Liberace exercised even tighter control over his public narrative. His private relationships were kept strictly out of view, and those who lived with him were never mentioned publicly. Meanwhile, his television image continued to be that of a charming, unattached performer, admired by women. This prolonged contradiction was not the result of self-deception, but of Liberace's understanding that his career depended entirely on preserving that external image. Only after Liberace's death in 1987 did the full picture begin to emerge through later documentation and civil court proceedings. The public then realized how far he had gone to protect his televised persona. For Liberace, denial was not a personal choice, but a condition of survival maintained through money influence and total control over information. And if Liberace represents concealment through confrontation and denial, the final figure on this list chose a far quieter path, one in which silence became a non-negotiable professional requirement. 15. Paul Winchell, keeping personal life completely private to protect a children's entertainment image. Paul Winchell understood a truth few were willing to state openly in children's television: an entertainer's personal life does not belong to them. From the moment he became a familiar presence through talking puppet characters on American television in the 1950s, Winchell was held to far stricter standards than performers in adult-oriented entertainment. His programs were built on parental trust and the promise of being completely safe for children. Any question about private life could have destroyed not only his career, but an entire ecosystem of children's programming. As a result, Winchell proactively constructed an unbreakable boundary around his personal life. His 3 marriages and 6 children were often cited by the press as evidence of a proper private life. Those who worked in the industry, however, understood that this also functioned as an effective layer of protection, stopping curiosity before it began. Winchell rarely discussed personal matters beyond the minimum necessary facts, avoided social events, kept the press away from private spaces, and almost never appeared in Hollywood's behind-the-scenes narratives. This level of concealment lasted for decades, to the point that Paul Winchell's personal life barely existed in the public imagination. As his television career wound down, he shifted his focus to biomedical research, and even patented a heart assist device, details that further reinforced an image of seriousness and respectability. When Winchell died in 2005, tributes focused entirely on his entertainment legacy and scientific contributions, while his private life remained outside the official story. This illustrates that for some performers, concealment was not a temporary phase, but a lifelong condition, one that became inseparable from their work itself. If any of these stories surprised you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more behind-the-scenes Hollywood stories that are rarely told. Because some truths only truly begin to be heard once they are finally spoken.